Hello there. Today we're going to be talking about some rookie prospects that we're going to make us a little selfish. Players that I have ranked way higher or way lower than the consensus rookie rankings here at Football Guys. Right, Vig?
Yeah, and here's something that's important. The reason why I like that this is a show where we just talk about your thought process is we like to teach the thought process. Going back to the roots of the Pretend GM show anyway, is like not just giving you information, but teaching you how we think about it. And you're a guy who not just looks at the stats, but you're also a scout or a former scout, and you like look at the video. So I thought this would be great. Let's see how someone who does these rankings thinks about them, and let's see why you're so far off from the consensus on some of these folks. So maybe we could all learn how to do the same thing. Makes fantasy football so much more fun.
Yeah, and what I think is so important to understand and acknowledge about fantasy football, right, is that the game is ever changing. So no matter what your level of competence in this field is or what your experience is, you always need to be willing to learn. You need to be willing to kind of push what your knowledge is, right, and close that knowledge gap. So even for me, where I was like, oh yeah, I used to evaluate film, that doesn't mean anything now here years and years later. Okay, the game has changed, and the way that metrics are used and analytics into fantasy football is totally different. So yeah, this is gonna be a really fun exercise. But before we get started, I want to remind all of you guys, hit that like button. It's such a big deal for us here. It helps us grow the channel, continue our work for you. Also, if you're not subscribed to the Football Guys YouTube channel, you should be. This month and the rest of May here is going to be all about the rookie draft dynasty content. So if you have any questions about your rookie draft or which rookies you should be targeting or just your dynasty team in general, drop it in the comments below and I'm going to get back to each and every one of those as I can. All right, Vig, let's get started here with these players that we're going to start with the first guy who is a player that I like less than the Football Guys consensus. And we're starting with Michael Mayer, the tight end who is now on the Las Vegas Raiders, who I've got him ranked as my number 21 player. When we do these rankings, we're talking about single quarterback format. Okay. Not super flex, not much changes in super flex because of this class here, but we're going to talk about single quarterback format. I've got him ranked as my number 21 player. And Football Guys has him ranked as the number 12 overall player. So I am 9 spots lower than Michael Mayer. Vic, I can't imagine taking him in the first round because that's what's being basically indicated here, right? Being number 12, you're taking him in the first round of a single quarterback draft. Michael Mayer is my number 3 tight end in this class. That doesn't make him a bad prospect or a bad pick. I just don't think that I can do that in the first round of my draft.
And I think that's what I really hope people take away from this. I don't want people to be like, "Oh my God, Alfredo thinks Michael Myers is horrible," or that or I don't want them to say, "Hey, why did Alfredo say he's the tight end 3 but has him so low?" We just have to think for a second. Tight end 3 this year doesn't mean the same as tight end 3 other years, right? Some years the tight end 1 was Kyle Pitts, other years the tight end 1 is like Greg Dulcich. Overall, a tight end 3 can end up being far, far, far lower in production and value for many years. And even people who go off as like the rookie wide receiver 15, 18, 24. So I think these numbers matter, but I think it's important to think about them in context too.
Yeah, and that context is so important, right? Because you can go back and look last year, like the number 1 tight end across the board was Trey McBride, right? Some people may have had Greg Dulcich in there as like the 1B or whatever it was, but no matter how you slice it, Michael Mayer's a better prospect than they were. So just because he's the tight end 3 this year doesn't mean that he wouldn't be better than other players. So having that context is important. And I think that context then carries over to the NFL, right? We're talking about these guys who are going from the college game into the pros and they have to mesh into a whole new system. And he got drafted by the Las Vegas Raiders right there in the early second round, nearly first round. But Raiders GM Dave Ziegler has already said that, this first year could be a bit of a developmental year in terms of his receiving work. And I think that a lot of people are a little bit surprised by that because many, many, many people thought that Michael Mayer was this very polished, very complete prospect. He was getting the nickname Baby Gronk, which I think was a bit premature. He didn't quite have the athleticism, but this is not something that's totally foreign. Most tight ends need year 1 as a developmental year. So hearing this isn't all that crazy.
Yeah, and even think about the number of tight ends that take more than like year 1, 2, or 3 even to become fantasy relevant. Ziegler's not talking about fantasy here. Ziegler's just talking about like, what does this guy mean to our team? How can we use him? And speaking of that team, Austin Hooper is probably the better receiving tight end. But who knows? May or may find himself on the field a lot more because the guy's a better blocker. And this is a run-first team with Josh Jacobs. We saw what they did last year. And then looking at what competition Mayer has that gives us some pause. He's got, there's Adams, there's Jacoby Myers, there's Hunter Renfrow. Lots of folks on this offense that can really be high-volume guys. So even if Mayer's on the field a lot because he's the better blocker, does that really mean he's in a great situation?
Yeah, and that's important, right? Is we're looking at a guy where he's going to have to be very efficient in a Jimmy Garoppolo led offense. that, as you said, has so many other weapons that could go ahead of him. So we may not see that production early in his career. Once again, does not mean he is bad for fantasy, right? Does not mean that he cannot produce later. But I think that the ceiling is very limited early on. And by no means, like I've said this a bunch of times already, not a bad player, but there's some obvious holes in the profile. And one of them for Michael Mayer is just that he's a good or okay athlete, not a great athlete. His athletic profile scored out at a 7.6 out of 10 on the relative athletic score. And typically, what you're going to see, and I'll dive into this a bit deeper here, but the average top 12 fantasy tight end has an average relative athletic score of 8.6. So Michael Mayer hasn't even crossed that 8.0 threshold here in terms of his athletic ability.
Alfredo, can I just, you said you're going to go into it later, but there's some listeners who don't know what the RAS or relative athletic score is. Can you just sort of tell us? I think it kind of makes sense. I'm guessing you look at like how good they are compared to others, but like, what do they actually look at?
Yeah, so the relative athletic score, it's going to be a compilation of all the athletic testing numbers, typically from the combine, or if they don't test in the combine, they'll do pro day. But they want to do this as something that measures comparatively against the other players who are doing the same testing. So we're talking about 3-cone drills, broad jumps, vertical jumps, height, weight, 40, 10-yard splits, all that stuff. And they're going to take these numbers and correlate them to the height and weight, and then obviously compare them to the other players. And that's why it's the relative athletic score. This is something that's done by Kent Lee Platt. You can follow him on Twitter at MathBomb. He does these really great player cards of all these guys and how they compare to one another. But we've seen that when it comes to tight end, this is the position that I would say most relies on athleticism to stand out from the position, because tight end is such a wasteland in terms of fantasy production. And in recent years, we've really only seen a handful of guys be able to be productive at the tight end position without being a superior athlete. We're talking about like Mark Andrews. Yeah, you're betting on an outlier there, or Zach Ertz and Dalton Schultz. And these are guys that they got touchdowns. They got a lot of high volume. They weren't necessarily creating big plays. Zach Ertz was always considered the guy that kind of falls down after he catches a football. Dalton Schultz, a lot of people still don't believe in him after 2 years of production because of that limited athletic profile. And there's a really great article on all of this by Christian Williams, one of our own staff members here at Football Guys. You can find it here on footballguys.com. I will drop the link in the description below. But he does a really great study on the archetype of a top 12 fantasy tight end. And he did that for the top 12 of all positions: quarterback, running back, wide receiver. It's really great. But this is one of those things where Michael Mayer, because of the limited athletic profile, I really struggle to take him highly, especially when we're talking about here, number 12 overall. I struggle to see that upside with him in this offense and with his limited athletic profile. Vig, let's go to a guy here who I'm a bit more positive on. And I'm still surprised that people are not high enough on this player yet. And I'm talking about Packers' new wide receiver, Jayden Reed. I've got him ranked as my number 15 overall player. Football Guys, what are we doing here? I gotta talk to Joe B. I gotta talk to the rest of the staff, because they've got him ranked as the number 23 overall player in single quarterback format. And I'm 8 spots higher on Jayden Reed than the consensus here at Football Guys. And I just don't get how a guy who is essentially going to be an NFL starting wide receiver on day one is falling to the end of the second round in a rookie draft, when so many people are complaining that this rookie draft isn't all that talented. I just don't see how you maybe even drop him past, let's say, pick 18, arguably, right? It's weird to me, Big.
Yeah, it just doesn't make a lot of sense, right? You have a team like the Green Bay Packers who had a very clear need for a wide receiver. They then use a pretty high draft capital, right? The guy gets drafted relatively early to fill a need in an offense that's going to need him. So, there may be better wide receivers or worse wide receivers in other situations, but this guy's just in a great situation. And then we know he can play well. Matt Harmon, someone we all respect a lot. He has reception perception, which is, Alfred, you can tell us a little bit more about that. But on reception perception, Jayden Reed grades out really well.
Yeah, so reception perception done by Matt Harmon. You mentioned former Football Guy staffer. What's up? And he does a really good job. So what he does, he takes, he looks at what all these wide receivers do, and he's going to chart their usage and success rate of each route run by these wide receivers and how they do against press or zone coverage, right? So he's taking a look at everything: their success rates versus types of coverage, their success rates on certain types of routes, and then how often they're running these routes. So it's important not just to watch film or look at the metrics, but to put context to all these numbers as well.
Yeah, and speaking of some of that context, you mentioned the different kinds of coverage that this guy might face in the NFL. we've seen him do well against press or zone coverage, which is going to like bring a lot of versatility. He really should have declared as a junior, right? Having double-digit touchdowns, 1,000 yards is what a lot of people say. So maybe he dropped a little bit further because of that. But we know he has a talent. We know he's in a pretty great situation overall. And do the Packers have a pretty decent track record of drafting wide receivers? I don't know. What do you think?
Yeah, no, so I tweeted this out the other day, and Vig, like you mentioned, he got high draft capital, right? We're talking about a guy that was picked number 50 overall, and I think that surprised a lot of people in the NFL draft. But the Packers have kind of made their living off of drafting good starting wide receivers in the second round. Let me list some of these names for you, okay? These are Packers wide receivers drafted in the second round over the last 15 years. So there's a track record. I know before we start to get the comments of like, it was a different GM and a different coach and a different everything, like, yeah, I get it, but there are still there are scouts, there are staff members, there are philosophies that transcend regimes, right? And they carry over from one GM to the next or one coach to the next. So just like how we all look at the Pittsburgh Steelers and say, hey, they're good at drafting wide receivers, it's a very similar thing here. And so these are Packers wide receivers drafted in the second round over the last 15 years. We're looking at Jaden Reed here in 2023. Last year was Christian Watson in 2022. Then we go all the way back. This was such they trolled Aaron Rodgers so hard. You go all the way back to 2014, the last time they drafted a wide receiver in the second round. It was Devontae Adams in 2014, Randall Cobb in 2011, and then Jordy Nelson back in 2008. So you're looking at all of those guys who were fantastic wide receivers, immediate producers on the Packers. Maybe Devontae Adams took a little bit of time, but to see their track record in the second round, it's awesome. And it gives me a lot of hope for a guy that I was already very high on. And so to see the team has that kind of conviction where they're able to take a guy top 50, that's awesome. He should have immediate production as a rookie. He has the versatility to start inside or outside. I'm talking about slot or outside, as like a Z receiver. He's fast enough to be moving around like that. He should be the number 2 target on this team by day one. Christian Watson will probably still be the number 1, but because of his skill set, because of the types of routes he runs, he may not have those crazy explosive over the top plays like Christian Watson. So that could lend to him being more of a volume funnel, a target hog for a guy like Jordan Love, who's going to need to find comfortability in this offense. So I'm pretty high on Jaden Reed, Vig, and I think he's absolutely worth taking in your top 15 picks and early in your second round of rookie drafts, regardless of the format. Now, let's take a look at a guy that I like less than the consensus. And this one, I'm 7 spots lower on Rashee Rice, the wide receiver for the Kansas City Chiefs coming out of SMU. I've got him ranked as my number 24 player. Football Guys has him as their number 17 player. And when it comes to Rashee Rice, I struggle to have a very strong opinion about him. I like the college production, so the numbers look good. I like his new QB because obviously it's Patrick Mahomes. I'm not a fan of what I saw on tape. I'm not a fan of what I saw on tape. He's a guy that I think needs development. And the Chiefs kind of have made this interesting habit out of drafting these kind of guys they want to develop, and they're kind of figuring out how to do that, whether it was like Sky Moore or the trade for Kadarius Toney. They've tried to use guys, but it's interesting because I saw Rashee Rice strictly as an outside guy that needs to run better routes, have more consistent hands, doesn't have a lot of experience beating a corner in a one-on-one matchup. And I think this is interesting because I think that his fit with the Chiefs becomes really clouded. Vig, I was listening to something the other day with Chiefs general manager Brett Veach. He talked about Rashee Rice being an inside guy after spending so much of his college career being an outside guy who was an over the top threat. Now he's being talked about as a guy that can work inside, run after the catch, and win contested catches. And that sounds a lot like what they already have. A lot of redundancy on that roster.
Yeah, and I think this is what's important to think about. Like, these are professionals, right? The general managers, the scouts, all these folks that work for the teams, and we are at the end of the day, fantasy football. We're folks who are talking. We're talking about a game, and I know we love to like really get down into the weeds, but it is sort of odd because the fantasy analysts out here were thinking that he would be like a Valdez Scantling replacement as the deep threat, and that Sky Moore could be Juju, and Kadarius Toney would just be like a souped up Nicole Hardman. So again, you're like, I think I like the word you said. You said like his fit with the Chiefs is a little bit clouded. I don't really know what his role is going to be. I think part of this is certainly, like you said, anyone who plays with Mahomes throwing the football gets a little bit of a bump for fantasy football standpoint. But I guess, here's sort of a teaching point, and Alfredo, maybe you can walk us through how you like to think about this, but maybe some of the discrepancy in the consensus ranking and your ranking is sort of, I don't know how everyone in the consensus is looking at short-term versus long-term prospects for these rookies when it comes to Dynasty. And maybe people are just thinking about this differently, but Is your sort of ranking off the consensus because of what you're thinking about him in the like right now in the next couple of years versus maybe 3 4 years down the road?
Yeah, I think that with especially with dynasty football, right, is I think that everyone tries to think way too long term. 3 years down the road is just not always likely. We never know what's going to happen. We've seen even some of the best players at the wide receiver position, Michael Thomas, Antonio Brown, and how things change in just a matter of one season, 2 seasons, whatever it is. So when we look at these rookies and we think, oh yeah, he's going to be really good for 3, 4, 5 years down the road. He's tied to Patrick Mahomes. He's a rookie. He just needs time to develop. Sure, but that needs to be baked into his cost when you're drafting a player like this and how you're ranking them. And one thing that I think that gets kind of underutilized or underrepresented when looking at these rookies is how much they're going to produce immediately. And to me, the immediate production just doesn't seem likely on this team. He's probably going to be the third or fourth wide receiver target on the depth chart. And those targets are also going to fall behind Travis Kelce and Jerick McKinnon, who was actually fourth in the team in targets last season with 71. So we're talking about now this rookie Rashee Rice, who's going to be the fifth or sixth target in terms of what he can get his rookie season here with the Chiefs. And we saw last year that Patrick Mahomes was willing to spread the ball around a lot more. So now you're talking about a guy who's going to be fifth or sixth on a team that's spreading the ball out, and it is still Travis Kelce's team. And then the fit is weird. So I struggle to take a guy like that so early in my rookie drafts or rank him really high.
Yeah, and you talked about the short term, but even for the long term, right? So much is up in the air. We have no idea how he's going to develop in the NFL. And even if he does do really well, he may have a few not so great seasons to start just for the reasons you've already mentioned. And then how often do we really see elite or fantastic fantasy production from players that didn't really get a lot of playing time in their first 2 years or didn't put up great numbers in their first 2 to 3 years from a wide receiver standpoint? It's just a very rare thing. And that really only happens with some of the top prospects. And I don't know. Rashee Rice was just no one's really top wide receiver prospect.
Yeah, and you know what, Vic, you mentioned something there about like not seeing the production early on, and that typically doesn't turn into fantasy production later. People are always going to be really quick to mention players like a Devontae Adams or guys who did break out later on. You can't always think of these guys in terms of outliers. And if that's the justifying factor that makes you say, well, I'm going to draft him because he can be an outlier, because he does have that potential with Patrick Mahomes and that big playability, that's fine. But you have to bake that into his cost. So I think saying that you're going to take him, at pick 17, pick 16, 15,
Mm.
that's a bit rich for me on a guy who's going to have a lot of risk involved. Whereas I think, if you're getting him last pick of the second round, early third round, which maybe even is too low, but that's where I'm willing to take the risk on a guy like this. When I already have a good team set in place and I'm probably one of those championship contenders, that's like, let me see what I have for the future here. And let me have a guy that I can, leave on my bench, put on a taxi squad, whatever it may be. All right, let's move on to our next player. And this is a guy that, once again, very high on. Surprise football guys is this low on him, but is Marvin Mims, wide receiver for the Denver Broncos. I've got him as my number 16 overall player. The football guys consensus has him at 22. So, Vig, I am 6 spots higher than the football guys consensus
Yeah.
on Broncos wide receiver Marvin Mims.
Yeah, this is sort of odd. I feel like, I work a lot with you, so I kind of can even guess what you're thinking. But Sean Payton, the Broncos, didn't have a ton of draft capital walking into this draft. And they traded up for Marvin Mims after having a pretty rough season last year for the Broncos. Like, you don't do that without a clear plan. You don't go up and trade for a wide receiver unless you're really trying to help support Russell Wilson.
Yeah, and so like that's interesting to me because I think that so many people are saying that Mims is probably, I think a lot of people are trying to highlight him or profile him as the Rashee Rice, as a guy that, like, he's going to need time to develop and he's a big risk. But there's a big difference in a team trading up for a player, right, when they already have guys at that position, because it seems like Sean Payton is not in love with what they have currently there. It does seem like he's not willing to hold on to a lot of those players. And, what I think is interesting is you start to look back at Sean Payton's track record. And Marvin Mims has a really similar skill set to guys that Sean Payton has drafted before. And I'm talking about, you go way back here, Robert Meacham with the Saints. This is a long time ago. It was a long time ago. Kenny
Bobby
Stills.
Meacham.
Yeah, Bob Meacham. That's what he goes by. Bob Meacham. Kenneth Stills. Now we're just going very proper names here. So Kenneth Stills, and then Brandon Cooks. And these are all three guys that I think have similar skill sets to Marvin Mims, in that they are field stretchers. They're not, they weren't technically considered like your number one kind of alpha wide receivers, but all these guys had 700 to 1,100 yards within their first 2 seasons producing in a Sean Payton offense. And I think that's what we're looking at here with Marvin Mims. Am I suggesting that he's going to be a 1,000-yard receiver right off the bat and get you 9, 10 touchdowns? Probably not, but he's likely going to be a pretty good wide receiver too for this Broncos team. And I think that he's got an immediate role as a field stretcher for the Broncos, where he's going to be a guy that's going to not only play to Russell Wilson's strengths with the deep ball, but he's also going to complement Jerry Jeudy very well. Who Jeudy is a more nuanced route runner, a guy who can be that top target for this team, whereas Mims is better off in that complementary role. You know, a guy that's going to be the sort of speed slot, we can call it that, or maybe even a Z receiver as a guy that's going to be moving around a lot on that offense and used as the speedy guy that's going to be drawing the defense away from players like Jeudy and Dulcich in the run game. I think it's going to be very similar to how to how we saw Brandon Cooks being used in the Sean Payton offense, but also how Russ used Tyler Lockett in that Seattle Seahawks offense for so many years.
And I always like to imagine what are the comments going to be, and I can already see it coming. They're going to say, "Wait, hold up! You guys just said all this stuff about Rashee Rice and how there's too many people there, and Mahomes is going to have to spread the ball a lot, and that made you get kind of low on Rashee Rice. But now, are you really excited about Marvin Mims? And we gave you some reasons, but you're right. I hear you. You're going to say the wide receiver room is really crowded. How is this going to work out? Like, it just doesn't make sense. This is where sometimes you have to really look at what people in the know are saying. Look at what the beat writers are talking about. Look at, sometimes it's okay to follow the rumor mill a little bit. Look at the financial aspects of this, right? Teams are not just trying to win Super Bowls. They have to be financially, they have to make good decisions. And I think that's where this wide receiver room is just not that crowded as we think. Cortland Sutton, great talent, but lots of talk about him being on the trade block. And that would, clear up a lot of space for this team. And then there's clear cut candidates on the squad. Like, we're not saying they're not talented, but Tim Patrick, KJ Hamler, there's a lot of reason to suspect they may not be on the Broncos roster come to start a season. They may find themselves elsewhere, which again goes along with that whole teams have a plan. You don't go trade up and grab a Marvin Mims if you don't have a plan with what to do with some of these other players.
Yeah, and that context that you provide, Vic, is so important. And we're not saying Marvin Mims is the surefire, wide receiver one for the Broncos, or even, a top 24 wide receiver in fantasy. But we're saying that he's got a role, and that role can be expanded so much more. And there's a track record of what we've seen with Sean Payton, whereas that track record so far of what we've seen in Kansas City is a bit clouded because we don't know. We've seen Patrick Mahomes with Tyreek Hill. We've seen Patrick Mahomes with Travis Kelce, who's still there. And we've seen what has happened with the running back usage in an Andy Reid offense and with Patrick Mahomes and how that ball gets to a guy like Jerick McKinnon, 50 plus times. So I think there's a better situation there in Denver. I'm personally a fan of the talent of Marvin Mims over a guy like Rashee Rice, and I think that the numbers also justify that as well. So it's not just a film thing or an opinion thing. I think there's multiple there's multiple threads here that lend to Marvin Mims being the better prospect. That's in a little bit of a better scenario, I would say, especially with that trade up and the usage of the draft capital. It shows conviction by this team that wants to use him. All right, let's get to our next player here, and that is Hendon Hooker, quarterback for the Detroit Lions. And I don't value him as highly as the rest of the Football Guys staff here. I've got him ranked as my number 43 player. And I know that might sound shocking to a lot of people, but Football Guys consensus rankings here, they've got him at pick 30, or excuse me, not pick 30, but player 30. I'm 13 spots lower on Hendon Hooker than the rest of the staff here at Football Guys.
Yeah, I think part of the context of course, just to remind everyone, we're not talking super flex here. Right. We're just talking one quarterback. But again, Lions head coach Dan Campbell kind of said this is like a redshirt season for Hooker. We know he's recovering from an ACL tear. From an injury standpoint, I'm actually not that worried. He's not the kind of quarterback where he's going to have like a challenging recovery timeline or anything. And if he's sort of sitting and waiting to learn the game, which is going to be really important because at Tennessee, he didn't really have to read both sides of the field. That offense does not translate extraordinarily well to what he's going to be expected to do in the NFL. So he's going to need lots of experience learning the game, but also he's going to need some playing experience as well. So I just really think that, if you're drafting, like you're right, you're putting him on a taxi squad, you're really hoping he'll develop into something. Speaking of I don't know, well, forget this season. Next season, is there really a great shot, do you think, that he's going to be the starter there?
Well, and that's how you have to think of it. You have to think of it that way because of this talk about he's going to be a redshirt, player. Talk about the ACL, you talk about the fact that he's going to need a lot of time to develop and learn how to work an NFL offense. So could he become the starter in 2024? I don't see it being very likely. Jared Goff's already rumored to be getting a contract extension. And even if he doesn't, he's under contract until 2025. So we're talking about if, he takes over after Jared Goff and becomes the heir apparent, Hendon Hooker is going to be 27 years old with minimal NFL experience. There is a very real scenario here where Jared Goff just kind of turns back into Jared Goof and he just poops his pants here in 2023. And Hendon Hooker gets an early opportunity, maybe late in the season, and they just say, okay, let's run it back again in 2024 with Hendon Hooker. Let's see how that goes. But it just doesn't seem likely with the type of weapons they have on this team. It is so set for Jared Goff to be successful. They've got a good offensive line. They've got the return of their offensive coordinator, Ben Johnson. They've got all these weapons when you're looking at Jahmyr Gibbs and Sam Laporta, Jamison Williams, Amon-Ra St. Brown. They brought back some of their other ancillary pieces on this offense. So yeah, everything is set up really nicely for Jared Goff. So I don't necessarily see him failing this year. And so let's say that maybe by the time Jared Goff is done, you see Hendon Hooker become the starter in 2025. It's likely going to be a new offense because I don't see this team kind of remaining status quo. I don't think they can. Either this team is so successful that Jared Goff is going to get that contract extension, or they are so successful on offense that Ben Johnson, their offensive coordinator, is off to another team, or they are so bad that they just commit to the rebuild. They commit to the tank. Dan Campbell is fired. Potentially their GM, Brad Holmes, could get fired after a couple seasons here. Ben Johnson is gone. Like, I don't see a very clear path here for Hendon Hooker to be the starting quarterback of the Lions offense, no matter what year it is. And I think a lot of that kind of gets baked into the fact of where he got drafted in the NFL draft.
Yeah, and I think it's something important to talk about again. We talked about, are we looking for where most people are going to be, or are we looking for the outliers? And I think the odds are sort of stacked against third round quarterbacks being elite fantasy producers, right? Over the last decade, there's been a singular quarterback who's been a top 20 fantasy producer, and that was Russell Wilson. Otherwise, the rest of these folks, and I'm not saying like these are good or bad quarterbacks. Look, they're in the NFL. They are amongst the best players to play the game. It's just, it didn't always translate to the NFL. Names like Kellen Mond, Davis Mills, Mason Rudolph, Davis Webb, CJ Beathard, Cody Kessler. I'm just having fun now. Sean Mannion. Like, these are not folks who have historically just, they're good players. They just haven't been great for fantasy purposes. And you might say this third round draft that you guys are talking about, that's such an arbitrary label, and it is. But right. I think it's still a little relevant that you have not seen a great hit rate for quarterbacks that are drafted there. And part of that is they just don't get the time to develop. And there's a reason they were drafted there anyway. Their talent, where they were as prospects, they just weren't as high. And so I think, again, that's what we have to think about. This big picture, if I had to give you, a Hendon Hooker sort of like statement, it would be that for him to be a great fantasy football quarterback, he would really, really have to be an outlier. And again, we are not looking for the outliers here. We're really trying to find who is going to contribute. It's sort of based on like where they're going to be on average.
And you can take it a step further, Vig. Like you mentioned the players who, we're not trying to be mean, but by all intents and purposes have not been good in the NFL. Now let's take a look at even the moderate success stories of a guy like Mike Glennon, who you could probably put him in here with this other list as well, but he was a backup and he's selected in the third round. Jacoby Brissett has had, some moderate success here in the NFL, but even him, he was like a top, he was like QB 20, I think, in his best season ever. So we're not looking at a very good track record. We will see where this goes, because last year we had Desmond Ridder, Malik Willis. I think there was one more. I can't remember who else it was, but we'll see where this goes. I don't think that just because this is how it happened in the past, it's how it's going to continue. Trends are made to be broken, but there's a reason that this trend is here and why we haven't seen a lot of success. It's just the talent doesn't always equate to high levels of fantasy success. So that's why I'm not that high on Hendon Hooker for fantasy purposes. Let's get to our last player here. And this guy I am higher on than the football guys consensus. You like my thumbs up there, Vig, when I do it? Yeah, it looks, it's boom. Just in case you weren't sure.
Very
higher.
Corny.
Yes. But I am higher on Puka Nacua, and it's just so much fun to say. Like, I want to bring this guy up every episode. So Puka Nacua, wide receiver from BYU. He is now on the Los Angeles Rams. I've got him ranked as my number 35 player. It's not all that crazy. You're taking him at the end of the third round, potentially in a single quarterback league. Football Guys consensus rankings has him at player number 46. So you're talking about maybe him being there at the end of the fourth round if you're looking at rankings that way. I'm 11 spots higher than the rest of the consensus here at Football Guys, and that seems really, really high.
Yeah, I already see the YouTube comments. They're like, you just talked about how Hendon Hooker's not going to be really great because he's in the third round, and third round quarterbacks don't do well. And they're like, day three wide receivers don't do well, Vig. Why do you guys like Puka Nakua? And you're right, day three wide receivers are not typically fantasy relevant, but there's like zero risk in taking this guy at the end of the third or early fourth round in your rookie drafts, right? And the other thing is, unlike Hooker and other folks, he has an early potential role in the NFL. That depth chart has a lot of players. There's a lot of players in the wide receiver, but it's actually kind of empty, right? Outside of Cooper Cup, who are we talking? Cooper Cup. Sorry, who are we talking about here? You have Tutu Atwell, Lance McCutcheon, Van Jefferson, Ben Skornick. Like, these are not players who we project are going to be like outstanding fantasy wide receivers. And let's be honest, Van Jefferson's going to be a free agent after the season too. So there is a potential role. And again, this is someone we're talking about drafting at the end of like the third round in the rookie drafts. That's a gamble I'm willing to take. And there's a potential role for this guy to be a year one producer, but definitely even more so in year two.
Yeah, and I think the good thing is that you learn pretty quickly whether or not Puka Nakua is going to be good in the NFL. Because if he can't beat out this group of receivers, then he's probably not going to be successful in the NFL. And so you know that you're done with him there. You don't have to keep holding out hope and stashing him on your bench. And that's the good thing about drafting a guy with like a late third round pick here, or early fourth round, depending on where he's falling in your drafts. But you took a look at his prospect profile coming out of BYU, and a lot of people were pretty high on Puka Nakua, and there was a lot of people in the fantasy community that got really excited about him. He played primarily on the outside at BYU, and he had a pretty good career yards per route run at BYU. We're talking about 3.45 yards per route run, is second amongst all the wide receivers drafted over the last 4 years. He led the 2023 class in yards per route run as well. To give you some context, I said that 3.45. Tyreek Hill led the NFL last year in yards per route run at 3.2. So it kind of gives you an idea. Obviously, you can't always compare BYU to the top wide receivers in the NFL, but it gives you some sort of context as to what types of routes these guys are running.
Does it give context? You're just using like really fancy stats again. 3.2 and 3.45 sound like really low numbers. What in the yards per? I mean, it makes sense. How many yards are they running when they run a route? But like, why does that actually mean anything to me?
It sounds like pi, Vig. What's pi? 3.14159 something?
Yeah, pretty good. Yeah,
You're smart.
Yeah, pretty good.
What is it?
3.1415.
3.1415.
22 divided by 7.
Let's go. I love pi. I love pi. Whether not math pi, like regular pi. So I don't know why we just went off the rails here. We started talking about pi in the 30th minute of the show.
You went off the rails here, sir.
True.
I just want to know why I should care about yards per route run.
Yeah, my bad. All right, let's get back on track. Here's the yards per route run. It typically means that a player is getting the responsibility of running routes downfield, right? When you talk about these guys that are gadget players or they're not going to be the main focus of an offense, they're usually running a lot of those routes that are behind the line of scrimmage or very short distances. So when you see a player's yards per route run be a bit further downfield, it's a good indicator of a player's ability to not only run an intricate route and beat a defender one-on-one, but be the primary target for an offense. It's actually been proven to be a pretty good metric of indicating fantasy success, fantasy production. You take a look at the top NFL players in yards per route run last season with at least 50 targets. Vig, I want you to spot the bad player here on this list, okay? Tyreek Hill, Justin Jefferson, A.J. Brown, Stephon Diggs, Devontae Adams, Chris Olave, Cooper Kupp, Amon-Ra St. Brown, CeeDee Lamb. Did you find anyone there in those top 10 that are not good at football or not producing for fantasy?
Clearly Tyreek Hill. Tyreek Hill is the outlier.
Yeah, shut up.
Not a great wide receiver. Plays for the Dolphins. Can't be great.
Stop it. Don't try to put that evil on me. But we're seeing, right? Like, obviously, no one single stat becomes the skeleton key to produce or to predict fantasy success. But when you're talking about guys that, man, you look at a metric and you say, okay, this kind of lends towards all of the best players at this position in this game, it's useful. And I think that so much of it just goes back to, how was he able to do this in college? Can that translate to the NFL? Does he have the opportunity, which we're seeing? In college, he was graded as Pro Football Focus's second best wide receiver in all of college football last season. He's got that versatility to even, like, it's not big, but he can be a rusher as well. He had 39 carries over his last couple seasons at BYU. So I think when you start to take all of the different factors of this prospect profile for a guy like Puka Nakua, and you take a look at the opportunity that presents itself there for the Rams, you start to see, like, maybe he becomes that Robert Woods replacement that they wanted Allen Robinson to be last year, and the Rams kind of went all in on. I know we're asking a lot here of a day 3 wide receiver to be the Robert Woods replacement, but it's not out of the realm of possibility. And once again, that gets baked into the low risk draft pick here. They have nearly identical athletic testing scores, which we talked about how important athletic testing is for tight ends. It's also pretty important for wide receivers. A very similar skill set to a guy like Robert Woods. And fun fact here, Vig, okay, Cooper Kupp and Puka
Is it
Nacua.
going to be fun though? Is it actually going to be fun?
Why? Yes, it's always fun. I don't say fun fact if it's not actually
Okay.
a fun fact. All right, so
I don't know, man. Sometimes you say fun fact and it's very much not fun. So I just wanted to clarify. You think this is actually fun before you want to put it on a
well,
show.
now if I say it, it's probably not going to sound as cool because you hyped it up so much. It's not. I'm just going to say it. So Cooper Kupp and Puka Nacua share the same former wide receivers coach in college. So there's going to be concepts and things that each of them know and can share and discuss. And I think it could make this transition to the NFL and specifically the Rams offense a little bit easier for a guy like Puka Nacua. Vig, I'm not sure. Have you had any interest in Puka Nacua when you're there in your rookie drafts?
Yeah, same for the same reasons you say. I feel like he often falls to the end of the third round. I've had him be present in the fourth round, and I just feel like that is a great place to pick him. If he doesn't pan out, that's okay. It's not a big deal, right? Those are like throwaway draft picks that we add on to trade sometimes. But if he does, like you said, this is someone who I can get great value out of, and sometimes that's what we're looking for great value in fantasy football drafts.
Well, there it is. We went through all 6 of these players that I am either higher or lower on. By the way, you can take a look at all of these rookie rankings. You go to footballguys.com and you can check out all the rookie rankings. You need to be an elite subscriber, though. Okay. Right now, the plans are really, really cheap. We're talking about, Vig, we're talking about the most affordable fantasy football subscriber plan in all of the industry. Okay. Head on over to footballguys.com and you can see all of our fantasy football rankings. You can see our dynasty rankings there, and it's one really low price. That's it for us today. Vic, we're going to be back next week, though. We're going to keep talking more about these rookies, more dynasty content for you guys. Don't forget, make sure you have liked and subscribed to this channel. Leave a comment if you have any questions about your dynasty team. And that's it for us today. So for myself, for Dr. Vig, we'll see you guys next week. Adios.